Hey, what's up, viewer? Welcome to day 6, hour 7 of Nebulous live development. I think 7 hours is my personal record so far for a day, which isn't so bad. I'm still trying to push it further and further to get to a point where I can get this game done. So with that, I am going to jump back into this hour of live development. So as I was working on it last time, I was setting up these elements to have their proper ratio set up. However, this one is causing me some issues. Because I tossed a visual element in here, so if I delete this, now there's all three of these here. And the idea was to add an element for the ship values. And to do that, I would have to, the idea was add an element, and then this element needs to grow, or perhaps expand its element. No, that didn't work either. So maybe grow the element. Alright, so I toss this element in here. Oh, I was also considering using some different code to reference the children elements differently. Okay, so maybe this element was actually a considered to grow to 0 because this is actually going to be one of these, basically. So there has to be a text value. There has to be another text value. And then there more or less need to be like 2 buttons. Now let's zoom in on this to get a better look at it. Effectively, what we want is something like this, but it needs to organize its elements in a different fashion. So in this instance, it would be this way, and this button is above this label. And this button is essentially a negative sign for remove, and this one is essentially a plus sign for add, for investment. And then there's a label above this, which means this visual element would arguably have a black background for denoting its type. However, it's now in an awkward position where it doesn't really need to be growing by 1, so I'm going to set this back to 0. And the element isn't centered. But that's separate from this. So this is actually supposed to be up a tier, it looks like. The label, the visual element. And it's not centered properly. Once again. I guess this manages its own elements, so it'll center. This is more or less how it works. So this one, for instance, would say, yes, the most cliche one is attack and damage. We can even say weapon damage to be more... I'm not sure. But in this instance, we've got, essentially, we want this entire background here to be black. And we want to scale this a little differently. Oh, and this label placeholder for now is like basically 000. Wait, oh, whoops, that's the wrong thing. Hold on. So here we want to, hold on. Okay, so right here we want to say 000.000 to represent kind of the range potential. But then we really want the, oh, it is dark, but it's scaled incorrectly, so what we end up having to do is duplicating it out a couple times. Which means I could, in fact, just grab it and take a look at what kind of sizes work percentile-wise on it. So 33%. Still a good idea. The height's not so bad, though. So we could squeak in maybe 4 or 5 rows. So 15, we have functionally 15 ship values. So if we take a look here at the text, we can set the color to white on these. And then we can more or less see if we can set up a margin. And I think margin's on the outside, so let's see, 1%. Can I do this? It's kind of big. It might be too big, but we'll see. And we can simply help that by making this 32%. And essentially now what we can do is duplicate this a couple times and match it up to some other types. So ship research values buttons. Ship research values elements. Ship research values label. Ship research values buttons. So I actually am duplicating this. I can actually fit 5 in here. So 5 by 3, 15. Probably 6. So 18. I can fit 18 ship values in here. So what if I organize this element by doing left to right. Now the ship values are really janky, but there's too many of them. So I'm going to delete 3 of them and fix. Oh, you know what? I jacked up because let's see, ship values. I think that still makes sense, maybe like this. But these don't have an element. So I would have to experiment with an element. That can be left or right and overflows in the downward direction. Let's see if that happens though. Okay, so that did not work. So the only thing I can imagine would be the easy thing, I suppose, would be to just have a new row for element per element. So essentially this is a row, and if I start copying them down, this can happen. And now we have 18 ship values. It might be too many, so I'm going to try and scale back 1. And now it's 15 ship values. And each time I scale it back, that's 15. So we would have to manually expand the height of these. And the best way to do that would be to remove these 2 and grab the only one that's there and then change its height value to some percentage. And if there's 5 of them, that's a little weird how that's set up. So it has a visual element. We would want to assume this visual element is flexed all the way. But these buttons would be, if we're placing 4 in there, 24%, perhaps. And then let's give that a shot on duplication. So we'll duplicate this one twice, and duplicate this one 3 times. And the only thing I messed up must have been, no, I guess not. I messed up something with this element. So I'm going to set it to go to 0, and now it's got this issue again. It's not spreading these elements properly. And for some reason setting these to auto is better. It's filling them in. So now if we look at the element, now the element should duplicate 4 times. Yeah, it's almost correct. It technically goes up to like 5 times. However, it's not spacing around the way I would like it to. So we need another element to spread that properly, but how come the math is off here? If it's the it's changed to auto, is that correct? Okay. So these would have to have a height of some value. And the height that I decided on was 24%, I thought, still. In which case, the buttons would need to grow larger, like this. Not seeing that do it. The button isn't doing anything else at this point here. That's because this isn't set up. So let's go back in here and turn this grow off. And now we'll see the setup I'm looking for. So now if we duplicate these, I should be able to fit them in pretty good here. And now we have 12 ship values. And they're fit in pretty good. We are going to have to change a lot of their values. However, that's going to be a little easier if I utilize child elements. Okay, so ship research values buttons is actually weapon damage. It's going to call it weapon damage. So weapon damage has a name, or let's see here. This would have actually been useful in the duplicate. So let's call this remove investment. We'll call this invest. And this label is the value. This label is the title. And effectively we could say weapon damage dot child and grab some stuff. Or we might have to specify by saying ship research. Yeah, we can essentially say research values, child, weapon damage, child, and then the ones we need. I feel like that makes enough sense to redo these. And now we can run through these to change some of the values. We are going to change. See, these just stay the same. The label changes to, say, weapon range. And change just to weapon range. Then we've got this one, which is rate of fire. Then we can move down a tier, and we've got shield capacity. And we're looking at shield recharge. Then we're looking at capacitor capacity. You might rename to like capacitor total, since it's a little too wide there. We'll leave it as capacitor capacity for now though. I can't bring myself to leave it there. I'll call it capacitor max. Alright. So then after that we've got capacitor recharge. And from here we've got I suppose we have we can call this subspace thrust. And then we can go with warp speed, assuming it has a warp drive. And then we've got in this instance it's I guess the accurate name would be warp calculation. Calculation. Whoops, this was wrong. So I don't have a great name for this one, but it's warp something. Warp, and I want to see calculation. But that's kind of lame. Warp calculation. I forgot one weapon type also, which was tracking. Yeah, I mean, shoot, I might even need another row for this. Yeah, Rid is on the right track here. Let's see, warp calculation. Warp timer, warp start. Warp charge. I call it pre-warp. Warp calculation is unfortunately the most accurate. And I'm going to move down to this one, and man, I'm going to have to swap like a bazillion things. And I have to drop a tier down on each of them. Okay, I think I can do that. So let's do weapon tracking. Weapon is so generic, it doesn't get more specific, like torpedoes versus guns or something like that. So weapon tracking. And we're going to move weapon tracking into here. Then we're going to move subspace thrust down. And we are going to move capacitor max down. Alright, so that's that. That leaves one last value. So the weapons are pretty good. I guess there's like essentially agility is what I'm thinking. Subspace agility. So there's subspace thrust, but there might not be good rotation of the ship hull. So essentially the idea I've got is hull rotation. Oh, and I can't do that with a, I cannot put a space in there, so. Hull rotation, and then change the label to say hull rotation. And the idea would eventually be to color code these to some degree. And for some reason I'm lagging up a little bit. Just a smidge. So now I've got all these values set up. Let's see how they look in the editor. And they're a little screwed up. And I suppose that is because the buttons are growing or the font's too big. So let me take a look here. Because these are all now plugged in to the system. They have auto size height, spread alignment. They don't have any growth property. Let's see what happens if we use a shrink property though. Okay, so if I shrink them, maybe they will change their size correctly. Yeah, no, those are so screwed up. Let's see, did I put all these in an element, or? I did put them all in an element, and they're all set up like this. What if I manually center them all like this? I think that's still gonna be a little weird. This element is not growing, but is shrinking. But then these values are too large. It looks like they are still being weird, so I'm going to try lowering the font size. Once compilation is finished. If that doesn't work, I'll just lower their size manually. But then I might have to go through and like change all of them. I'm not gonna be able to just change one of them, and or I don't want to reduplicate them after naming them all. More or less. So yeah, it's just in the wrong spot. So I guess we need to try lowering the font size. It's the first thing I'm going to try. It's already a size 12, so if I change it to 9, and change this one to a 9, let's see how that looks. See if the button shrinks properly. And it looks like they may have shrunk just a little bit, but not much. The button is still way too big. Even though the button should be contained properly. Okay, so the font thing's not exactly going to work. It's more about changing the... I guess I'm just going to have to change the manual size of this. I can't remember what I did for this other one, actually. No shrink, no grow. There is a manual size. Height's automatic though. This is no shrink and no grow. So no shrink, no grow. a little bit of a manual size. So if I set the width to percentage, it's going at the size of its basically direct parent. And we can just squeak that down to 20%. Perhaps. And then we might as well make it by like 10% height. 15% maybe. Because that's referring to its parent like that too, okay. I normalize it by going like this though, and then let's see if this helps. No, it does not. Man, weird. I'm just getting screwed up by this big time. So these buttons are just not conforming well. This element has up-down direction so that there's a label, and then a visual element that is supposed to be centering its elements. And for some reason its buttons are just way too big. These values didn't matter. So if we take another look over here, these are essentially the same concept. It should be automatic on these buttons. And the containing element is supposed to contain them properly. So this is supposed to be containing them, but they are expanding beyond it. Which is just incorrect. But if I take another look at it, yeah, it's still just weird. I may wind up putting the UI builder on my other screen so I can get a little bit faster response time. From changes. And yeah, I'm just messing this up just barely somehow. For some reason these buttons aren't changing their size properly. And I keep comparing them to these buttons over here, but they're the same. They have the same settings. Manual width, but the percentages, or but the height is not manual. There is a no wrap on the text. And that's the same thing here. So I was looking at like a manual size is the only way. But when I tried that, it was not doing great. maybe the container is expanding, and that is having an effect on it. Man, I'm not sure why this button is giving me such trouble. Essentially, or let me see, what's this got here? This is a string value. This would be I'd imagine this would contain it, though, is why I'm confused. And it should be contained by this element. So what if I run this as centered? So it didn't do anything, actually. Looks like. I'm surprised this is every once in a while this UI thing just I think I've got it under my belt and then throws little roadblocks in here and there. Yeah, it's still the same thing. Man, so maybe the copy pasting screwed it up. Or maybe, let me double check. Maybe these elements were not actually divided in, I can't remember if I did, how I did this now. I did use 2 rows. 3 rows. I named them. At one point I thought maybe that was the problem. For some reason I'm thinking that still. So let's see if we go to research values. And they name the visual element something generic like values element. And let's see if I manage to change the size of the buttons in the game mode. Okay, no. So the only thing I can imagine is like shoot, I really don't know. Just being completely honest, I have no clue. I'm gonna have to mess around with this for a while to see why it's not working. For whatever reason, it won't translate over to the game view. And it's almost like the buttons aren't paying attention to the margins or something. Which isn't exactly correct either. I'm just gonna have to start it from scratch to a certain extent. Darn. I did come up with some values though. Might as well just call this first row, or first, I'll just call this first element. Let's see if this fixes it also. Just out of curiosity. Nope, still broken, okay. So I'm just gonna have to yank them out.
Basically, all three of these need to get yanked. And then let's take a look at this. The buttons are still way too big. So then we will drop, figure out where it's at here. This first element, we want to drop these two. And kind of we have to work from scratch here. So if we have one button in there, the buttons are just too humongous for some reason. Even though we've scaled them down pretty good. So if I take a look at this element, it shouldn't be scaling the button size. The label shouldn't be having much of an effect on it. Let's change the shrink to 1 value. I think I've done that before though. The button itself is expanding. See what something like this looks like. And the buttons are still humongous. Alright, so the only thing I've got left is to try hard capping the size of the button. So we're doing 20%. Height's about 20%. It's a little weird here though. Doesn't really do much. So let's make it 35%. It's still just not working. Like, let me double check. These are buttons, correct? Yeah, it's a button. For some reason, it's just not taking this alignment. It's not aligning properly. And honestly, I'm not sure why. Because these other buttons are like basically the same thing, so. The only thing I can really imagine would be this label is actually not even saying damage all the way. So there's just not as much space as it looks like for some reason. But I'm still not sure why the button size is stuck. So if we go down here, the design is, it's just the button. The buttons are not nested with the value. And the only way I can imagine that would be to try to go like this. But then we would just basically need another element. Up to, what, this point here? That way we can set this to left alignment. Centered. And then auto these values. And they're tiny, even with our text in there. So it should have a text. And it's not working. Interesting. Okay, I'm not getting anything different from that. This first button is like trying to determine what the heck is even different. They're both set to auto. The alignment's the same. Flex is 1, 0. 1, 0. Yeah, it's picking mode position. Yeah, I don't know the difference. I don't know why this one's breaking on me. Let's see if I delete it and add a new button. Change to minus sign again. And then mess with the text value. Just double check that the colors are correct. And it's once again breaking on me. Okay, now it's back. Weird. Okay, so the problem is that it's still screwing up in the game view. The buttons are too huge. So I must have added like too many elements or something. I may have to redo the whole thing. Not very cool, not very cool. Dang it, it looks so good. I mean, it looks fine in the freaking thing. But unfortunately, not quite. Not gonna work it out, so like... I thought it was a good idea to use percentage systems. It's got some percentage. So for whatever reason, these are just cleaner, running cleaner than up here, where the buttons are way too humongous. And the label is not even going to fit in there. Yeah, I don't understand why the size is off. Alright, so I'm just going to have to redo this whole thing. I don't know what else to do. So I'm going to delete weapon damage. And now I just have the shift values. Now I'm going to take another look at this. So this is hard-coded as this percentage. Which I was thinking 32 due to the margins. Same thing here. And then the idea was still to essentially add an element to this. Not sure what this is doing here. I guess this is the breakup element. It turns into 4 rows, but something is jacking it up for some reason. So how about in here? Can we set 2 buttons in here or what? The label in between with centered policy or whatever. More or less like this. Does it make the buttons, or are the buttons just way too big by default? And yes, they are. So these buttons are bizarrely incorrect. I kind of had them working up until this point. Somehow I fixed them down here. It's got the same settings. It does have a manual size set at 5%, which I tried manual sizes. Oh, I guess perhaps. Let's just try it. 5%. In both accounts, basically. 5%. Let's just see if this changes the size drastically or not. If we take a look at it, we'll say it's a little better on the height. The width is still too big, but maybe that's because the button text is too large, so let's change this to a negative sign. And then change the width to, oh, it's at 35, so change it to 5. And now let's take a look. I might have just been miss looking at the text. Okay, yeah, so I suppose I can just use manual size change to fix this. I just did it wrong. So now I'm going to have to come back after this video, the next one, and I'm going to have to reconfigure all of that. But I can set it up properly now that I understand where I'm screwing things up. And once this one's done, once these are done, then I can move some down here. And then after that, we'll have to set it up to actually invest in these things through the deficit system. And there's other values to plug in.
and stuff to change, so we'll get there. But we'll effectively have a lot to most of the research system built up before we even drop our first ship into the game. So let's see how that goes. I've got a little bit more to go, but I'm going to drop this video since it's at 1 hour, and thank you for taking a look so far. I basically was screwing that video up a little bit, so I appreciate you watching. I've got a lot more to do though, so I will see you in the next one. Take care.